There is a piece of land in the United States that has never legally belonged to anyone. No deed, no sale, no recorded theft. It appears on tax maps, yet no owner is listed. A farmhouse once stood there, lived in, maintained, and suddenly abandoned. The family inside vanished without a missing persons report, without witnesses, without a trace. Years later, officials found documents that should not exist, tied to parcels that were never recorded. What happened on this land wasn't forgotten. It was deliberately erased. In the United States, land ownership is one of the most carefully documented systems in human history. Every acre is surveyed, assigned a number, taxed, transferred, and preserved in records meant to last forever. Property tells a story: who lived there, who paid for it, who passed it on. So when a piece of land exists without a deed, without a traceable owner, and without a legal beginning or end, it creates a problem the system was never designed to explain. Tonight's story isn't about a haunted house or an unsolved murder in the traditional sense. It's about something quieter and far more unsettling. A farmhouse that appeared on maps but not in ledgers. A family that vanished without triggering an investigation. And a silence so complete it suggests intent. This is the story of a property that history refuses to acknowledge, and the people who disappeared with it. By the late 1880s, Clay County, Missouri sat at a crossroads of progress and uncertainty. Rail lines were creeping westward, farms were expanding, and surveyors moved through the countryside with clipboards and measuring chains, turning open land into numbered property. Ownership meant legitimacy. If land wasn't claimed, it was claimed for you. And yet, just beyond the county's eastern boundary, there existed a narrow stretch of land that refused to conform. The farmhouse stood alone at the end of what locals called a road, though it was little more than a dirt path worn thin by time. It didn't appear on official maps, yet everyone knew where it was. Travelers used it as a reference point. Surveyors marked it, erased it, then marked it again. Even livestock seemed to avoid grazing too close, as if the ground itself carried a warning. The structure was modest but carefully maintained. A single-story wooden house with a pitched roof, a stone chimney, and a barn set back just far enough to suggest planning. The well was deep and functional. The walls bore fresh repairs. Someone lived there with intention, not desperation. What unsettled officials was not the house, but the land beneath it. The surrounding fields showed no clear purpose, no long-term crops, no pasture fences, just earth that looked worked, then abandoned, then worked again. Soil samples taken years later would show signs of repeated clearing, as though the land had been prepared for something that never arrived. In 1889, a county survey team attempted to formally register the property. They measured boundaries, set temporary markers, and recorded coordinates. When the data was returned to the clerk's office, the parcel number assigned to the land overlapped with two others, both of which already belonged to powerful interests connected to future rail development. Rather than correct the conflict, the entry was quietly shelved. No one pushed the issue, not because it was difficult, but because it was inconvenient. Locals who passed the farmhouse noticed its isolation. No children were seen playing near the road. No signs marked the property line. Visitors were rare, and those who did approach were rarely welcomed inside. Still, the family kept the place in good order. Smoke rose from the chimney each winter, the garden was tended, repairs were made promptly. This wasn't a forgotten homestead. It was an unrecognized one. At night, lantern light could be seen moving between the house and barn. The glow suggested routines, feeding animals, drawing water, locking doors. Life unfolded there quietly, outside the documentation that defined everyone else's existence. By day, the farmhouse cast an unremarkable silhouette against the Missouri sky. but surveyors complained that compasses behaved oddly near the property, forcing repeated measurements. Whether this was coincidence or human error was never determined. What was recorded, however, was the frequency with which notes were crossed out and rewritten. One surveyor wrote simply, "Property location stable, claim unclear." That phrase would resurface again and again in county correspondence. The land sat in a narrow corridor between expansion zones, too valuable to ignore, too problematic to claim. It was neither wilderness nor officially settled, a league blind spot. To the railroad companies mapping future routes, the farmhouse was an obstacle. To county officials, it was an administrative headache. To the people living there, it was simply home. And yet, something about the place seemed to invite avoidance. Officials delayed visits, clerks misplaced files, tax assessors recorded the land but never collected payment. Each small failure fed into the next, creating a pattern of neglect that bordered on intent. By the end of 1890, the farmhouse had existed for years without acknowledgement, standing quietly while the world reorganized around it. New roads curved away, rail plans shifted, boundaries were redrawn with suspicious precision. The land did not resist. It was simply excluded. In a country defined by ownership, that exclusion would prove dangerous. Because land without a deed is not protected, and people who live on it are easy to erase.
If the land itself felt out of place, the paperwork surrounding it was worse. Clay County's record room sat in the basement of the courthouse, a low-ceilinged space lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of leather-bound deed books. Every transaction, every farm sold, every inheritance settled was meant to live there permanently. Ink was law, paper was memory. And yet, when clerks attempted to trace the farmhouse's ownership, the trail collapsed almost immediately. Deed Book 47 should have contained the original claim. The index referenced a parcel number assigned in 1873, a year when large portions of the county were formally divided and registered. But the page itself had been torn out, not ripped, but carefully removed, leaving the binding intact. In Deed Book 52, the parcel appeared again, this time as a transfer. No buyer listed, no seller named. Only a vague description of boundaries that matched the farmhouse's location with uncomfortable precision. The entry ended mid-line. By the late 1880s, clerks began adding annotations in the margins. These weren't formal corrections, they were warnings. Chain incomplete. Prior claim unverifiable. Do not assign without review. Review, however, never came. Tax records deepened the confusion. The land appeared annually on assessment rolls, its value estimated conservatively, its location confirmed. But each year, the column for payment remained blank. No delinquency notices were sent, no auctions scheduled, no penalties applied. It was as if the county acknowledged the land's existence, but refused to act on it. Census data told a similar story. In 1890, a household was briefly listed at the coordinates corresponding to the farmhouse. 5 occupants, names recorded once, ages approximated. Occupation listed simply as laborer. The following census omitted the address entirely. Not corrected, not explained, just removed. What unsettled later historians was the consistency of these failures. Missing records are common in the 19th century. Fires, floods, careless storage all leave gaps. But this was different. The omissions followed a pattern. Each document acknowledged the land just enough to avoid suspicion, then withdrew before establishing responsibility. Even court filings showed signs of interference. In one boundary dispute involving neighboring farms, the farmhouse property was referenced indirectly as the adjacent unclaimed ground. The phrasing was legally impossible. Land could be disputed, it could be abandoned, but it could not be unclaimed while simultaneously occupied. Yet no judge challenged the wording. Correspondence between county officials reveals hesitation bordering on fear. Letters mentioned the parcel obliquely, using phrases like, "that matter," or "the unresolved section." One clerk wrote that pursuing clarity might invite complications beyond our authority. Authority, it seemed, was the problem. By 1891, railroad interests had begun circulating informal maps, documents not meant for public view. These maps showed planned routes cutting directly through the farmhouse's land. On some versions, the house was marked. On others, it was erased. The variation depended on who was expected to read the document. One internal memo suggested delaying formal acquisition until occupancy issues resolved. No explanation followed, no eviction notices recorded, no compensation discussed. Officially, nothing was wrong. Unofficially, everything was stalled. Then came the quietest alteration of all. Sometime between 1890 and 1892, the parcel number associated with the land was reassigned to a location several miles away. The old coordinates were left floating, referenced but unattached, like a sentence without a subject. From that moment on, tracing ownership became impossible. Later clerks would try. They pulled books, compared handwriting, followed cross-references that led nowhere. Each attempt ended the same way, with a note in the margin and the file returned to the shelf. No theft was ever recorded, no fraud alleged, no crime acknowledged. The system didn't scream of corruption, it whispered of avoidance. The system hadn't failed, it had chosen not to see. And once paperwork looks away, the people connected to it don't stand much of a chance. Because when a place has no past on paper, it can be rewritten or erased without consequence.
The records never cared who lived on the land. People were secondary to parcels, footnotes to acreage. But the farmhouse was not empty. In 1890, a single census entry briefly acknowledged a family living at the disputed coordinates. 5 individuals, 1 household, no formal address. Their surname appeared once and never again. The Calderons. They were not from Clay County. No baptismal records placed them there. No marriage filings connected them to local churches. They arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if they understood that attention was dangerous. Neighbors remembered them as polite but distant. The father was seen most often, broad-shouldered, deliberate in his movements, a man who measured his words carefully. He traded labor for supplies, paid in cash, and refused credit. The mother rarely left the property, though when she did, she carried herself with an air of watchfulness that unsettled shopkeepers. The children were quiet, obedient, and never stayed long in public. They did not behave like squatters. They behaved like people protecting something. The family maintained the farmhouse meticulously. Repairs were done promptly. The well was reinforced. The barn's foundation was strengthened with stone hauled from miles away. None of this made sense for people without ownership, unless ownership in some form already existed. One neighbor later recalled a conversation with the father during the winter of 1890. When asked why he hadn't registered the land, the man reportedly replied, "Paper doesn't protect you. It tells them where you are." At the time, the comment was dismissed as paranoia. Later, it sounded like experience. Rail agents began appearing in the area that same year. They moved from farm to farm, offering buyouts and relocation packages. Most landowners welcomed the opportunity. The Calderons did not. Witnesses recalled the father standing at the edge of the road, refusing to let agents approach the house. No threats, no raised voice, just refusal. One agent later told a clerk that the man spoke as though the land wasn't negotiable. That phrasing raised eyebrows. It suggested prior claims or prior costs. The children were rarely seen after that. Their absence went unexplained. Some locals assumed they were being schooled at home.
Others claimed the family kept them hidden intentionally. No one pressed the issue. Rural communities were used to privacy. But by early 1891, the farmhouse began to feel closed. No smoke from the chimney, no lantern light after dark, no movement near the barn. The land remained tended, but no one was seen tending it. Then, one morning, a neighbor passed by and noticed the front door hanging slightly open. Inside, the house was intact. Beds made, table cleared, clothing still folded. It looked as though the family had stepped out and never returned. No signs of struggle, no valuables missing, no explanation offered. The sheriff's office made a brief notation: occupants presumed relocated. That was the extent of the investigation. No search parties were organized, no relatives contacted, no missing persons notice filed. The Calderons were never declared dead, they were simply removed from consideration. Later accounts paint a more troubling picture. One local claimed to hear wagon wheels late at night weeks earlier. Another recalled voices near the property long after the family should have been asleep. These stories were never documented. They existed only in memory, and memory without paper does not count. What remains undeniable is this: the family vanished at the precise moment their presence became inconvenient. They lived on land no one wanted to acknowledge, they refused to sell, and then they were gone. After their disappearance, county officials finally acted. The farmhouse was listed as abandoned. The land was reclassified. Future plans proceeded uninterrupted. No headstones mark the Calderons. No records trace their movements. Their names survive only because they were once written down and then crossed out. And in a system built on documentation, being erased from the page is often the final step before being erased from history. By the spring of 1891, the Calderon farmhouse no longer appeared lived in, though nothing had been destroyed. Beds remained neatly made, dishes sat stacked in the sink, lanterns hung from hooks as if waiting for hands that would never return. For those who knew the family, the sudden emptiness was the first warning that something was profoundly wrong. Yet for officials and neighbors alike, a strange consensus emerged. They must have moved. And just like that, the household disappeared from local consciousness. This was no ordinary silence. It wasn't the quiet that comes from neglect or even from death. It was deliberate, procedural, and chilling in its efficiency. The land, the house, the family, all present one day, absent the next, were treated as though they had never mattered. County clerks recorded the property as abandoned, assigning it a placeholder in tax rolls while leaving the parcel number unresolved. No one pressed for clarification. No one asked how an entire family could vanish without notice. Neighbors tried to speak, but memories faded quickly in the face of the official record. One elderly resident, recalling the farmhouse decades later, admitted he told only fragments of what he had witnessed. He had seen wagons parked at night, lanterns moving in and out, but the adults never spoke to him. "I thought it best not to interfere," he said. "Officials would never listen." That reluctance illustrates the deeper problem. The silence wasn't only in paperwork, it was cultural, institutional. In rural communities, disputes over land and money often went unreported. Authority deferred to convenience, and convenience dictated silence. For the Calderons, this meant that when they disappeared, there was no one empowered or willing to demand answers. Even newspapers failed to mention the family. Regional publications, which reported every death, every fire, every legal transfer of property, never acknowledged a single missing person report. The absence of coverage was striking. It was as if the town collectively agreed not to speak of them. Yet some traces persisted. Occasionally, travelers would reference the farmhouse in passing. "The house at the end of the old dirt road?" one would ask. "Yes, but no one lives there now," the other would reply. By the time decades passed, even this conversation became rare, leaving only fragments of oral history. The silence extended into county maps as well. Early 1890s plats depict the farmhouse in certain surveys, then remove it entirely from later drafts. Land that once had coordinates, boundaries, and markers was redrawn as unclaimed, an empty square on the page. Later planners, following these maps, treated the parcel as a legal void, a place that existed yet did not. Surveyors revisiting the site noted something else. The soil appeared disturbed. Fences that once delineated property lines had vanished. Trees planted by the Calderons had grown unchecked, some fallen, but no trace of cultivation remained. Nature seemed to reclaim the land quickly, as if the earth itself conspired with bureaucracy to erase any evidence of human presence. The silence was reinforced by inertia. Without a family to enforce rights, without records to assert ownership, the land became a liminal space, visible, tangible, yet legally vacant. Anyone could walk the property, survey it, or even trespass, and no one would be held accountable. The farmhouse stood quietly, the walls absorbing wind, rain, and the quiet passage of years, while county systems failed to recognize it. Perhaps most unnerving was the lack of follow-up. The sheriff's office filed a minimal note stating the property appeared abandoned. No search was initiated, no inquiries were made into relatives, no formal investigation pursued. In essence, the disappearance had been acknowledged only in its absence. The official record confirmed nothing, yet accepted nothing else. This is the type of silence that terrifies historians. A void enforced not by absence, but by neglect. The Calderons' existence, their work, their lives remained physically present, but systematically erased from the systems that define legitimacy. The house, the land, and the family continued to occupy space in the world, but only as shadows, ghosts of paperwork and memory. In time, the silence would become louder than any voice. The lack of action, the absence of curiosity, and the complete disregard by legal authorities would set the stage for the next chapter, discovery. Because silence, when left unchallenged, becomes a space where secrets can fester, and the land's hidden story would not remain buried forever. It wasn't until nearly 46 years later, in 1937, that the first tangible evidence of what had truly happened at the Calderon farmhouse came to light. By then, the land had been quietly cataloged as unclaimed in county records. Surveyors, sent by the federal government to evaluate land for infrastructure and potential road expansion, approached the farmhouse out of procedural necessity rather than curiosity. Few expected to find anything at all. The farmhouse had long since fallen into partial decay. The wooden siding was weathered and cracked, roof shingles had loosened, and the barn leaned perilously to one side. Vines crawled over the foundation, and the surrounding fields were overgrown, hiding the faint imprints of old garden rows and walking paths. Yet beneath that facade of abandonment, the land held secrets that would speak louder than any official record ever had. One morning, as the survey crew began clearing the area around the barn's foundation, a worker's pickaxe struck something solid. At first, they thought it was simply a buried rock, but when digging continued, the object revealed itself as a small wooden box reinforced with iron bands and rusted locks. Its placement, carefully buried beneath the barn's foundation, suggested deliberation. This was no accidental loss. Inside the box were items that should never have existed, at least according to official accounts. Burned land receipts, some partially legible, referenced parcel numbers that did not exist in any recorded book. Alongside them lay foreign coins, carefully stacked and dated decades earlier, coins from countries and mints with no connection to Clay County. And then, at the bottom, a small ledger, its pages blackened and brittle from fire damage, yet remarkably intact.
The ledger contained entries that would confound anyone attempting to reconcile them with public records. Payments were noted for holding fees and temporary claims, referencing the farmhouse property in terms that suggested both acknowledgement and denial. Each line contained numbers that matched plots on private maps, maps that were nowhere near public archives. There was evidence of repeated transaction attempts, all ending in ambiguity. The names of the Calderons appeared in shorthand, alongside cryptic notations: claim under review, dispute pending, do not record. The discovery sent shockwaves through the survey crew. They were trained to document what they found, but there were no protocols for this. The ledger and its contents directly contradicted every official narrative they had ever been given. The farmhouse was listed as abandoned, the land unclaimed, and yet here was material evidence that a family had actively maintained claims, made payments, and safeguarded items intended to preserve ownership. Word of the find traveled slowly. Some officials urged discretion, noting the potential complications for land reassignment, taxation, and infrastructure projects. One clerk later recounted that the ledger was confiscated for safekeeping and never returned to county archives. Copies or photographs were discouraged, and those few made were tightly controlled. It was as if the land itself had made a final, deliberate statement. What exists on paper can be hidden, but what is buried beneath it cannot be ignored forever. The implications were profound. For the first time, there was proof that the Calderons had not abandoned the land voluntarily. They had prepared for long-term occupation. They had safeguarded property records and valuables, and yet decades later, they were nowhere to be found. The box beneath the barn was a silent witness, evidence of a life interrupted, a claim denied, and a story suppressed. The discovery also exposed contradictions in the narrative offered by neighbors and officials alike. Residents who had said the family simply moved west could no longer claim ignorance. There was no western trail, no subsequent registration, no trace of their lives continuing elsewhere. And the documents found under the barn suggested that someone, somewhere, had actively ensured that the official record erased the family's existence and claim. For historians and investigators, the discovery was both tantalizing and frustrating. It answered one question: there was a story the official record refused to tell, but it raised countless others. Who buried the box? Who destroyed or altered the paperwork? And most importantly, what truly happened to the Calderons after they vanished from sight? The farmhouse, the land, and the documents beneath it spoke in silence. They told of careful preparation, of a family asserting ownership against invisible forces, and of a system that responded not with justice, but with erasure. This discovery, though hidden for decades, would become the foundation for understanding a deeper truth: that the Calderons' disappearance was not mere misfortune, and that the property they claimed was never meant to belong to anyone on record. The discovery beneath the barn was unsettling, but it also exposed a truth most people preferred not to confront. The Calderons had been erased intentionally, not by accident, not by circumstance, but by design. From the moment the farmhouse was first surveyed, the property existed in a legal gray area. Deed books were incomplete, tax records left unpaid, and maps redrawn. At first glance, these gaps could be attributed to clerical error, natural disasters, or human negligence. Yet decades of investigation revealed a pattern far too precise to be coincidental. Pages removed from records, contradictory parcel numbers, and cryptic annotations weren't mistakes. They were a deliberate effort to prevent anyone from claiming ownership or even acknowledging the Calderons' existence. Railroad expansion offers in the early 1890s brought the first real threat. Surveyors and land agents approached neighboring properties, purchasing, leasing, or condemning parcels to prepare for new routes. Every property changed hands with official documentation, but the Calderons resisted. The father reportedly refused every offer, insisting that the land wasn't for sale. The refusal alone would have been unusual, but the timing made it dangerous. Railroad planners needed that corridor,
Officials needed the paperwork to be clear, and a family standing in the way of progress could not be allowed to complicate matters. By late 1891, the Calderons vanished. Officially, there was no foul play, no missing persons report, no investigation. The farmhouse was listed as abandoned. The land, as far as the county was concerned, was unclaimed. Yet the discovery in 1937 revealed that the family had safeguarded proof of ownership and made repeated attempts to assert their claim. That evidence directly contradicted the official story. Whoever orchestrated the erasure had acted decisively, ensuring that physical existence did not equate to legal recognition. The mechanisms of the cover-up were subtle but effective. Tax records were left unpaid with no consequences. Boundaries were redrawn in county maps, leaving the farmhouse isolated in a legal void. Surveyors' reports conflicted with one another, creating contradictions that could never be reconciled. By manipulating the system's own reliance on paperwork, the Calderons' claim was nullified without violence or public confrontation. Their absence appeared natural, as if the land itself had always been uninhabited. Even oral histories were shaped to support the narrative. Neighbors who remembered the family were quietly dissuaded from speaking. Stories of wagons at night, lanterns moving behind closed windows, and conversations about ownership slowly faded, replaced by vague recollections of a family who moved away. The county, the railroad, and local authorities worked in tandem, intentionally or unconsciously, to suppress any contradictions. By the time historians and later surveyors arrived decades later, the silence was almost total. The box found under the barn underscores the meticulous planning of the Calderons. They buried their own proof, knowing that official channels could not protect it. They prepared for erasure, for removal, and for a time when no one would see the truth. That act itself highlights the danger they perceived, that authorities and developers valued control over legality, expediency over justice. No official records acknowledge a crime, but the implications are clear. The Calderons' disappearance, their absence from legal history, and the subsequent manipulation of the property all point to an orchestrated removal. Someone ensured that their lives and their land would vanish from the ledger, leaving only shadows. The cover-up wasn't a single act, it was decades of administrative silence, selective documentation, and deliberate inaction, all designed to create the illusion of nothingness. And yet the land remembered. The farmhouse, the buried ledger, the rusted box, all endured. The earth itself became a silent witness to what had been taken and hidden. The records could be erased, the family could be written out, but objects, when hidden carefully enough, cannot be fully silenced. This cover-up demonstrates a chilling reality. Systems built to maintain order can also be manipulated to erase lives. Legal recognition, property rights, census entries, all of these instruments of bureaucracy became tools of suppression. In the eyes of the law, the Calderons never existed. In reality, they did. And the truth, buried beneath barn foundations and forgotten parcels, persisted, waiting for those patient enough to uncover it. The question lingers: how many other properties, families, and lives have been quietly erased in the same way? How many disappearances are hidden behind the mundane facade of missing pages and incomplete ledgers? The Calderons were fortunate, perhaps, that the ledger survived, that the box remained intact. Without it, their story would have been swallowed entirely. And yet, even with the discovery, justice remained elusive. Ownership could not be restored. Names could not be returned. The land, though once fought for, remained unclaimed in the eyes of the law. The cover-up succeeded. The farmhouse, the family, and the parcel endure in shadows, a reminder that erasure does not require violence, only patience, indifference, and authority to manipulate records.
By the time historians and investigators pieced together the story of the Calderon farmhouse,
Decades had passed. The house was gone, the barn collapsed, and the fields were overgrown, returning to nature as if to erase every trace of human habitation. Yet the land itself retained memory, whispering fragments of a history that official records had refused to acknowledge. Every line in the ledger, every coin buried beneath the foundation, every scorched and crumbling receipt bore silent witness. The Calderons had existed. They had claimed what was theirs, and they had been removed, not by chance, but by design. It is tempting to measure justice in legal terms, deeds, court rulings, or restitution. Here, none existed. The property remained unclaimed. The family's disappearance went uninvestigated. In the eyes of the county, in the pages of the maps, and in the bureaucracy that defines legitimacy, the Calderons had never been there. And yet, their lives left traces that refuse to vanish entirely. The land remembers them, even if the law and society do not. The tragedy of the Calderons is not only in their physical disappearance, but in the systemic silence that allowed it to happen. Consider the official documents, the redrawn maps and the tax records. Every gap, every erasure, every unverified claim note represents an absence of accountability. When a system built to preserve ownership and history turns indifferent, or worse, complicit, erasure becomes effortless. A family can vanish without question. A property can exist in limbo for decades. Paperwork, which normally protects life and claim, becomes a tool of concealment. Even the discovery of the ledger and the buried box cannot restore what was lost. The coins, the receipts, the burned pages, they prove existence, but they cannot undo absence. Names cannot be returned. Days, years, and generations cannot be reclaimed. The Calderon story ends in questions, speculation, and fragments, reminding us of the fragility of recorded history. Without vigilance, without curiosity, entire lives can be quietly written out. Yet there is something profoundly human in the act of uncovering. By digging beneath the barn, examining the faded receipts, and piecing together oral histories, the story re-emerges from the shadows. It confronts us with uncomfortable truths, that disappearance can be deliberate, that bureaucracies can facilitate injustice, and that the official narrative is often incomplete. In the absence of formal records, memory and evidence become the guardians of truth. The land remains unchanged in appearance, yet charged with memory. The farmhouse is gone, but the outline of the foundation persists. Stones once carefully placed to support the barn now lie half buried in grass. Paths once walked by the family are faintly visible, more in the imprint on the soil than on any map. Nature has reclaimed the fields, but it has preserved a sense of presence, an echo of human life that refuses to be fully erased. The land itself becomes a witness, a testament to the Calderons' existence and the lengths taken to erase them from history. Reflecting on this, it becomes clear that history is fragile and justice is often incomplete. The Calderons' experience forces us to confront the limits of official documentation and the human costs of institutional silence. It reminds us that absence in records does not equal absence in reality, and it warns that when systems fail or are manipulated intentionally, entire lives can be buried beneath the weight of bureaucracy and time. Their story, hidden for decades, is now visible to those who look closely. It is not a story of closure, but of recognition. We cannot restore the lost years, the stolen rights, or the quiet lives erased from maps. We cannot return the family to the farmhouse. What we can do is acknowledge the truth that survives in fragments, artifacts, and whispers. In that acknowledgement lies a fragile form of justice, remembering what the official records tried to erase. The Calderons' disappearance and the strange limbo of the property leave a haunting lesson. History is not simply what is written down, it is also what is hidden, what is silenced, and what survives in shadow. And while systems can erase names, they cannot entirely erase presence.
Some histories aren't lost. They're hidden, buried beneath paperwork, beneath silence, beneath the earth itself. And sometimes they only speak to those patient enough to listen. If stories like this fascinate you, the forgotten, the erased, the secrets that linger in shadow, subscribe and join us. Every week we uncover the dark corners of history, the tales the maps and records tried to forget. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges what you think you know. Because the truth isn't always in plain sight. Sometimes it's buried and waiting for someone to find it.